Your expert is Leslie Alexander, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She earned a PhD in history from Cornell University. She wrote African or American and Fear of a Black Republic, and co-edited the Encyclopedia of African American History.
Welcome. I'm Leslie Alexander, and I'll be your host as we explore the African American experience from enslavement through legal emancipation. I've been a professor of African American history for more than 20 years. But even after all these years, I can still remember the exact moment when I knew I wanted to become a historian. I was just a sophomore in college, and I had just enrolled in my first African American studies class. At that point, I was sure I was going to major in political science and become a lawyer. But then I heard one lecture that changed everything. It was on the second day of class, on a bright, sunny day in California. I can still remember how the sunlight illuminated the classroom through the glass window. But my emotions on that day quickly turned dark. The professor began lecturing to us about the transatlantic trade in humans, more commonly known as the slave trade. For more than an hour, she told us the history of the trade, how millions of Africans were placed in shackles, sold to strangers, and forced onto ships headed for the Americas. In vivid detail, she described the trauma they suffered as they were ripped from their families, homes, and communities. She told us of the pain they endured as they were marched in shackles to the coastline for days or even weeks in blazing heat. She shared unimaginable tales of the conditions they survived as they lay in the bowels of slave ships for months, often on the verge of starvation and surrounded by death and disease. And then, once they landed in the Americas, they were sold into slavery. The slave trade, she told us, is how Africans came to America and how the history of African Americans began. As she spoke, I sat in my chair utterly mesmerized. I was just 19 years old, but I'd been in school for as long as I could remember. No one had ever told me this history before. I felt shocked, stunned, and sad. But most of all, I became obsessed with wanting to learn more about African American history, and I knew that I wanted to teach others. Teaching African American history has become my life's work, and in this series, I'll get to share much of what I've learned with you. My goal will be to expand your understanding of African American history, the breadth and depth of the Black experience in America, and also to highlight the significance of history in the present moment. We'll explore over 400 years of African American history, beginning in Africa. We'll begin there to better understand the rise and expansion of the transatlantic trade in humans. Then we'll discuss slavery's development during the colonial era. We'll see how the Enlightenment and the American Revolution not only birthed the United States, but also fueled the debate over slavery. Next, we'll discuss the process of emancipation in the North, alongside the dramatic expansion of slavery in the South. I'll examine how the northern and southern regions of the United States began to splinter and eventually found themselves embroiled in civil war. You can expect to understand in detail how conditions changed for Black people in both the North and the South as the United States became independent and as slavery expanded rapidly. We'll conclude with the era of Reconstruction, including the challenging process of emancipation in the South following the American Civil War. In this first session, we'll begin in pre-colonial Africa, as I always do when I teach Introduction to African American History in my college classes. I begin by discussing the empires and societies that existed along the Western African coastline long before the arrival of Europeans. Typically, my students wonder why. After all, they point out, isn't this a class on African American history? Why are we discussing pre-colonial Africa? It's a fair question, but as you'll see over the next few sessions, it's not possible to fully understand African American history, particularly early African American history, without knowing something about pre-colonial West Africa. After all, most people who were enslaved and brought to the Americas during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries came from Western Africa. And they brought cultural practices, spiritual worldviews, and labor systems that were born in their homeland. So, West African cultures and societies played a vital role in shaping the foundation of what became African American community and culture. For this reason, our exploration of African American history must begin in Africa. We'll focus primarily on the West and West Central African coastal regions, from the northern area along the Guinea coast, reaching down thousands of miles to the place where the Congo River stretches out into the ocean. In this first session, we'll explore the diversity of societal structures and community life in pre-colonial Africa. We'll begin with the three largest West African empires that formed in the northern sub-Saharan region, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Then we'll extend southward to examine the rich, complex societies that formed in the forested region along the Central African coastline. As we explore these societies, we'll consider how they eventually became vulnerable to European invasion. I'll also highlight key aspects of these communities that ultimately influenced Black life and culture in America. So let's begin with an overview of life and society in pre-colonial West Africa. By the time the first European ships began exploring the west coast of Africa in the early 15th century, the region had already been home to thriving settled communities for over 2,000 years. In the region immediately south of the Sahara Desert, communities had created thriving agriculture based primarily on grains such as millet and rice. Keep this information about rice cultivation in mind because it will become important in later lectures. Farther to the south, in the forested zones, societies had mastered iron smelting as early as 500 BCE. Armed with iron axes, hoes, and weapons, people in this region established large productive villages and large-scale agricultural enterprises. But the factor that sustained these communities more than anything was the vast trade network that spanned across the Sahara Desert, supplying West African societies with much-needed salt. Salt was an extremely valuable commodity in West Africa, since it allowed communities to preserve meat and to nourish their bodies in intense heat. Salt was so highly valued that West African societies willingly exchanged gold for it. In some cases, salt was quite literally worth its weight in gold. This trade economy eventually became vitally important to the region known as the Western Sudan, where three empires dominated West Africa in the centuries immediately before Europeans arrived. The first known Western Sudanese empire was the Kingdom of Ghana, north of the modern-day country of Ghana. Founded by the Sonenke people around 600 CE, the kingdom was strategically situated. It sat directly between the southern forest region and the northern desert region, along two major rivers. So Ghana's wealth was largely based on trade, because it was able to forge a powerful economic network that linked societies to each other. North Africans supplied cotton, silk, glass beads, horses, and salt, and Ghana provided pepper and gold in return. Although the Sonenke supplied gold to the trade network, they did not actually mine the gold themselves. Instead, they were simply middlemen who profited from taxing the gold as it passed from the southern region to North Africa. They were only able to maintain their position because they had a strong military. Their army was reportedly as large as 200,000 soldiers, armed with iron weapons. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Ghana's wealth expanded significantly as Arab nations became their main trade partners. Using camels to transport goods across the Sahara Desert, Ghana gradually became a massive empire, stretching over hundreds of miles and containing countless villages and societies. Salt and gold clearly dominated the economy during this era, but it's important to acknowledge that the Empire of Ghana also traded humans, typically captives of war who were sold as laborers across its territory. Even so, slavery never became the empire's primary focus, and enslavement in the region never developed into the brutal system of slavery that emerged in the Americas. Instead, the Ghanaian Empire maintained its power by building its wealth on gold. After centuries of economic dominance in West Africa, the Empire of Ghana eventually collapsed due to economic rivalries and climate change. Between 1000 and 1500 CE, West Africa suffered its longest dry period on record, causing a significant decrease in agricultural production. Fewer surplus crops triggered a chain reaction across the trade network, leading to a precipitous drop in trade and other commercial activities. Soon thereafter, internal rivals sought to gain control over Ghana's trade network. Following a protracted battle among various societies, the Mandinka people finally emerged victorious and established the Empire of Mali in the year 1235. The Empire of Mali dominated West Africa between the 13th and 15th century. It became the largest and most powerful kingdom in West Africa. Expanding over 1,500 miles, it stretched from the western coastline to east of the Niger River. At its height, it contained 8 million people and occupied more territory than Western Europe. Mali's first ruler was Sundiata Keita, a commanding military leader. Under his leadership, Mali grew even more wealthy than Ghana had been, primarily because Sundiata abandoned the previous strategy of acting as middlemen for the gold trade. Going directly to the source, he seized the gold mines located in Wangara, which allowed the Mali Empire to reap all the profits themselves. The Empire of Mali also experienced significant cultural change, particularly in the religious realm. Sundiata himself practiced indigenous spirituality. Citizens throughout his empire believed Sundiata possessed spiritual powers that he wielded to destroy his competitors. But despite his personal beliefs, Islam gradually began to take root in his empire. As trade with Arab nations expanded, so did the Islamic faith, particularly in the urban areas. During Sundiata's reign, Mali witnessed the rise of key cities, such as Timbuktu, which served as Mali's main trading hub. Reflecting the growth of Islam in the empire, Timbuktu became home to numerous mosques and schools, eventually making it a center for Islamic learning. In the year 1255, Sundiata died, leaving 3 sons who each served as Mali's leaders successively over the next few decades. In 1312, however, Sundiata's grandnephew, Mansa Musa, rose to power. During his rule, Mali reached the zenith of its wealth and influence. Harnessing the empire's military strength, Mansa Musa expanded its territory, reaching from the West African coast to the far interior, east of Timbuktu. Before long, Mali occupied nearly 500,000 square miles and included over 400 cities. Soon, the empire became legendary across the Mediterranean world. So, how and why did the Empire of Mali become so famous, especially in Europe? And why did Mansa Musa become so important to African American history? Well, it all began in 1324 when Mansa Musa began a pilgrimage to Mecca. All told, his journey took more than a year, since Mali was located nearly 3,000 miles from Mecca, and the trip occurred entirely on foot or on horseback. Even so, Mansa Musa could not be dissuaded. After all, a Hajj, a religious pilgrimage to Mecca, is expected of every Muslim at least once in their lives, and Mansa Musa was deeply dedicated to the principles of Islam. Accounts are filled with descriptions of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage and his subsequent arrival in Mecca. He and his entourage were a sight to behold. Arab observers noted that he traveled with as many as 60,000 servants, dressed in fine silk and carrying staffs made of solid gold. His caravan, which contained 80 camels and over 100 elephants, was loaded down with gold that he distributed in villages throughout his journey. Some scholars have suggested that he handed out as much as 18 tons of gold during the journey. Mansa Musa eventually arrived in Cairo and remained in Egypt for 3 months. During that time, he distributed so much gold that its value depreciated and remained depreciated for the next 12 years. Such flagrant and flamboyant displays could not go unnoticed. Rumors of Mansa Musa's extraordinary wealth spread quickly across the Mediterranean world, eventually reaching Spain and Portugal. And it literally placed Mali on the map. When Spanish cartographers created a new map around the year 1375, an image of Mansa Musa dominated West Africa. But not just any image of the king. In this depiction, he is seated on a throne, draped in robes, holding a nugget of gold in one hand and a golden staff in the other. And he has a large gold crown on his head, all highlighting Mansa Musa's power and extreme wealth. As the tales of an African king with immense piles of gold began to circulate across the Mediterranean, European explorers went in search of Mansa Musa. And eventually, they began mining the African coastline, not only for gold, but also for humans. By the time Mansa Musa began his epic journey to Mecca, the Empire of Mali was the largest, most powerful nation in West Africa. And scholars today believe that Mansa Musa was the wealthiest person in world history. But he didn't simply appropriate wealth for himself. He used Mali's trade profit to invest in his nation's infrastructure. Mosques and universities built in Timbuktu brought celebrated legal scholars, astronomers, and mathematicians to conduct research and teach citizens. As a devout Muslim, Mansa Musa also enhanced Timbuktu as a center for Islamic culture and learning. A scholarly debate remains about the date of Mansa Musa's death, although it was most likely in 1337. Regardless, historians agree that his death led to the gradual collapse of the empire. Mali suffered through a series of ineffective leaders, causing communities under the empire's rule to secede or rebel. In 1464, the entire province of Songhai declared its independence from Mali. By 1468, they captured Timbuktu and assumed control over the empire. Under the Songhai, the empire's first leader was Sunni Ali, a powerful military leader who eventually created the largest empire in the Western Sudan. So large, in fact, that it contained over 540,000 square miles and rivaled its counterparts around the world. As emperor, Sunni Ali employed an extremely effective strategy to solidify his power. He used the region's geography, especially the rivers, to obtain military might. The Niger River and its tributaries proved especially useful in allowing Ali to control the trade through his empire and to enforce his military authority. But perhaps the most important development during Ali's reign was his ability to gain control over the salt mines in Tagaza, just north of Timbuktu. Now, the Songhai controlled the gold mines and the salt mines, the two most desirable trade items in the region, bringing tremendous wealth and power to the empire. The Songhai Empire thrived under Ali's leadership, But in 1492, he died in a drowning accident. Initially succeeded by his son, a coup d'etat quickly removed him from power and established Askia Muhammad Touré as the new leader. Touré, also known as Askia the Great, is best known for his role in promoting Islam. Like Mansa Musa more than a century before, Touré was a devout Muslim. Unlike Musa, Askia the Great sought to convert his entire empire to Islam. In a show of devotion, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1496 and spent the next 3 years traveling to and from Mecca. Slightly less extravagant than Mansa Musa, Touré was mostly interested in religion and education. Under his guidance, theology and medicine became central to Timbuktu's university in hopes that his citizens might become literate and convert to Islam. Touré also invested in Songhai's administrative systems. He created a centralized government, established a taxation system, and even implemented wide-ranging trade regulations. Although the Songhai Empire flourished under his leadership, Touré began to suffer from blindness and senility toward the end of his life. In 1528, members of his family removed Touré from power and replaced him with his son. Yet again, a series of short-lived, ineffective leaders followed, and the empire weakened. Worse, Arab and European traders and explorers began invading Songhai territory in search of gold. The rumors of gold that began during Mansa Musa's reign and had continued for centuries finally began to have consequences. The death knell for the Songhai sounded in 1591 when the King of Morocco, desperate to gain control over the gold mines, sent thousands of troops into the heart of the empire. The journey was long and grueling, causing only a fraction of the army to get there alive. But the Moroccan soldiers brought guns, and the introduction of gunpowder changed everything. Although the Songhai possessed the strongest military in West Africa, their soldiers, armed primarily with bows and arrows, quickly succumbed to the gun-toting Moroccans, and the last Western Sudanese empire collapsed. The fall of the Songhai Empire is significant for many reasons. For our purposes, its demise was profoundly important to the eventual rise of the transatlantic trade in humans, because when the empire crumbled, the region was left without an overarching governmental structure to unite various ethnic groups together. So when Europeans arrived along the West African coast, determined to establish a large-scale trade in humans, that region of West Africa was largely defenseless against foreign invasion, especially invaders with guns. In future lectures, we'll discuss how, when, and why the trading of humans began along the African coastline. For now, I want to provide a brief overview of the societies and political structures that existed in West Africa at the time of European arrival. Specifically, I want to consider some of the commonalities that existed among these societies, because these commonalities eventually influenced the formation of what became Black or African American culture and community in colonial America. It's always a dangerous prospect to provide a general overview of a region's cultures and communities, because in doing so, we lose the beauty and uniqueness of its diversity. This is particularly true in sub-Saharan Africa, where literally thousands of different languages, economic and political structures, and cultural practices took root among hundreds of ethnic groups. But as this series on Black history unfolds, we must consider how people of African descent forged a sense of unified culture and community in colonial America. They did so only by drawing upon beliefs, systems, and practices that were common or at least vaguely familiar to all of them. We'll focus specifically on the forested region of West Africa, from which most Africans who came to mainland North America originated. This region encompassed the 2,000-mile-long coastal strip between Senegambia in the northwest and the Kingdom of Benin, or what is modern-day Nigeria and Cameroon, to the southeast. Sparsely populated and heavily forested, this area took longer to establish large settled communities than its northern counterparts in the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Dense, lush forest created a significant obstacle to the type of large-scale surplus-producing agricultural enterprise that could sustain an empire. As people developed tools and technology, villages and even small kingdoms began to emerge. None became as large and influential as the Western Sudanese empires, but some, like the Kingdom of Benin, became important societies in their region. Most economies in this region were based on a combination of agriculture and trade. Senegambians became particularly adept at grain cultivation, while societies such as the Yoruba relied on trading cloth and textiles, as well as bronze, brass, and terracotta sculptures. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Benin grew wealthy from trading gold, bronze, ivory, and pepper. Socially and politically, communities in the forest zones tended to be structured around complex systems of family, community, and lineage, in which everyone was viewed as part of an interconnected network. Throughout the region, family units varied widely. Some were based on a traditional nuclear family. Others encouraged people to live together in extended family units, with multiple generations living collectively under one roof. And still others allowed and endorsed polygamous families, in which men had multiple wives. Community structures were similarly complex. On one hand, most societies were class-based and emphasized hierarchy. Contrary to romantic stereotypes, these were not egalitarian communities in which everyone occupied equal status. Instead, there were strict hierarchies with chiefs, kings, political and military leaders, laborers, and numerous categories in between, often based on one's labor specialization. In other words, everyone was not equal. In fact, in most West African societies, there was a population of people that were considered slaves. But it's important to keep in mind that in most cases, these unfree people did not occupy the same dehumanizing status that enslaved people came to occupy in the Americas, nor did they ever become a large percentage of the overall population. Instead, they were a small minority that had become unfree for various reasons. Some were habitual debtors who needed to repay a loan through labor. Others were habitual criminals who needed to make restitution to society for their crime. Most were simply captives of war. Even while enslaved, though, they typically lived and worked alongside free members of the household on an equal basis. And except in the most extreme cases, they could eventually repay their debts and regain their status as a free and equal citizen. So hierarchy and unfreedom were common in West Africa prior to European contact. But that's not the end of the story. While most societies were committed to hierarchy, they were also highly communal, based on an understanding that the community could not survive without everyone's participation. As a result, community needs were prioritized over private property. And unlike in Western culture, one's status did not come from individual success. It came from family and kinship relations. Societies also tended to be politically decentralized. This doesn't mean that they had no political structure. It simply meant that power was not centralized in the hands of one person. Instead, societies were organized around villages and kinship networks, with all adults having an equal voice in political and economic decisions. Even women possess power in these communities. True, most West African societies assigned differing societal and economic functions to people based on gender, which meant that men and women were viewed as different, with unique roles to play in society. But different did not mean unequal. Again, recognizing that community survival depended on everyone's equal participation, men and women were equally valued for the work they performed. Even more, in many ethnic groups, women played vital economic roles that were not typically allowed in Western Europe. Predicated on the idea that people should be allowed to control what they produce, women were often active in the marketplace as both traders and merchants. And unlike in Europe and later in the British colonies in the Americas, women also could own or control their own property. In most West African societies, women, particularly older women, were also viewed as spiritual leaders and were often called upon to use their heightened abilities to mediate between the spiritual and the earthly realms. This leads us quite naturally to religion and spirituality in West Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans. Among the most enduring cultural influences that enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were their religious and spiritual beliefs. So it's important to briefly explore their spiritual worldviews. This is especially important because despite popular notions about Black Christianity during slavery, it often took generations for African peoples to convert to Christianity in the mainland colonies. Even when they did, they often blended Christianity with their own spiritual practices to create a uniquely African American form of Christianity. As discussed earlier, Islam became a powerful force in West Africa as early as the 7th century. Islam transformed this region because it stressed monotheism, the belief in one God, and encouraged literacy. As a result, a minority of Africans who came to the Americas were both literate and Muslim. But while Islam strongly influenced the elite and the urban dwellers, most West Africans did not immediately embrace Islam, choosing instead to remain true to their own beliefs. Scholars estimate that at the time of European arrival, about 95% of West Africans practiced their own indigenous religions, which were typically based on polytheism. That meant that in most cases, they believed that there was a main God who created the earth and ruled over the universe. But there were also lesser gods or other spiritual forces at work in the universe. These societies also emphasized pantheism, the belief that there is a spiritual force present in all life forms, including the earth, plants, and animals. These spiritual beliefs remained with African people for generations after they were enslaved and brought to the Americas. Perhaps the most resilient spiritual belief among enslaved people related to their notions about life and death. The most detailed example comes from the Bakongo people from the Congo-Angola region. Although most people enslaved in that territory were taken to Brazil, a small minority did make their way to mainland North America. The Bakongo, like many other West African societies, believed that death was simply another phase in the life cycle and did not necessarily represent the end of a person's existence. They also believed that their deceased ancestors were part of their daily lives and had the power to influence events on Earth. These notions about the immortality of the soul and the possibility that humans could communicate with the spiritual world remained a critical part of African American life and culture in the generations that followed. In our next sessions, keep these themes about community, culture, and spirituality in mind as we discuss the formation of African American communities. But first, we must discuss how and why Europeans began to explore the west coast of Africa. So next, we'll examine European exploration, the nature of the first encounters between Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans, and how the trade in humans across the Atlantic Ocean began. Here, because it reminds all of us that at the center of this story are millions of people, human beings who were bought and sold like property in order to enrich the lives of those who sought to deny their fundamental right to live free. Next, we'll delve deeply into the transatlantic trade in humans by examining a series of critical questions. How, when, and why did trading humans expand so rapidly beginning in the 16th century? Why were Africans willing to sell other Africans into slavery? And what was the relationship between the enslavement of Africans and the expansion of Europeans into the Americas? We'll grapple with these questions and more in our next session. I felt In 1418, Prince Henry of Portugal concocted a radical plan. For the first time in In 1418, Prince Henry of Portugal concocted a radical plan. For the first time in history, the prince believed he could successfully send Portuguese ships around the western edge of the African continent, down the coastline, past Cape Bojador. This was a risky proposition. Prior to that time, Europeans had never been able to safely travel beyond that point. Lack of sufficient navigational technology had prevented them from exploring any farther south and returning alive. But by 1418, times had changed. 3 years earlier, Henry's father, King John I, had commenced a successful invasion into North Africa. In 1415, the Portuguese military conquered a key port on the North African coast, just across from the Straits of Gibraltar, and tapped into the thriving trade network. It was there that Prince Henry learned about the vast, profitable trans-Saharan trade that transported salt, spices, and gold. He also heard rumors about gold mines and endless riches just south of the Sahara Desert. According to historical accounts, Henry was most interested in the caravans of gold that arrived regularly in the marketplace, and he wanted to locate the source of the gold. Inspired by the region's extraordinary wealth, the prince became fascinated, even obsessed, with sub-Saharan Africa, and resolved to send exploration parties farther south into the heart of the African continent. Over the next 30 years, Prince Henry, later known as Prince Henry the Navigator, financed numerous explorations seeking wealth in Africa. Henry and his team strategically launched their journeys from the islands located off Africa's western shores, allowing them to slowly but steadily make their way down the African coast. First, they came in search of gold, but quickly thereafter, they came in search of human laborers. Prince Henry then is ultimately responsible for financing the voyages that led to the transatlantic trade in humans, because the journeys he funded led to the capture and enslavement of the first African people. This session investigates the rise and expansion of European exploration in West Africa and the eventual development of human trading along the coastline. In particular, we'll discuss the internal dynamics that inspired Europeans to expand into West Africa and the technological advances that made exploration possible. We'll also investigate the role the Portuguese played in invading Africa and beginning a trade in humans that eventually spanned the Atlantic Ocean. To fully understand how and why the human trade began, we must first understand the issues and dynamics within European culture and society that created the desire for exploration, expansion, and eventually colonization. So there were three main factors that led to European expansion during the 15th century. First was a massive population boom, which led to shortages in land and resources. This information might seem surprising because typically when people think of life in 14th century Europe, they immediately conjure up images of massive pandemics, such as the bubonic plague, which spread rapidly across the region, killing millions. And it's certainly true that contagious illnesses like the Black Death took an incredible toll on Europe during this era. But despite the high mortality rates, Europe's population still more than doubled between the 11th and the 14th centuries. This dramatic growth meant that Europeans quickly found themselves seeking land and other basic resources in order to survive and thrive. As a result, they became increasingly curious about where around the world they might migrate. The second factor was radical technological advancement. During this era, Europeans developed new strategies that radically improved their agricultural productivity, including crop rotation and new methods for plowing and harvesting. These techniques and tools allowed for high-yield agricultural production. Once farmers began producing large quantities of crops and raw materials, the resulting surplus meant that there was increasing demand for new markets where goods could be sold. It also created a new merchant class, composed of people who were wealthy enough to finance exploration. The third, and perhaps the most important factor that stimulated European exploration was the Renaissance, a cultural revolution that inspired a renewed focus on art, literature, philosophy, and science. Typically, when I reach this point in my college classes, my students begin to wonder why I'm lecturing about the Renaissance. After all, they point out, the Renaissance was an artistic movement that produced Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and it was a literary movement that eventually produced Shakespeare. So what does the Renaissance have to do with European exploration and expansion? And what does it have to do with African American history? Good questions, I always say, because in contemporary society, we naturally tend to focus on the artistic aspects of the Renaissance. And we forget that it was not just about art, music, sculpture, and architecture. It was also a radical scientific and philosophical movement that dramatically changed European consciousness. Most scholars believe that the Renaissance was largely inspired by the Crusades, a series of military campaigns that the Catholic Church launched beginning in the 11th century that were intended to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Although the Crusades ultimately failed, the military returned to Italy with technological, literary, and scientific information that inspired a cultural revolution. Beginning in Italy, the Renaissance spread across Western Europe, reaching England, France, Germany, Hungary, Spain, Portugal, and eventually all of Northern Europe. And the shifts in scientific and philosophical thinking that occurred during this era had a profound impact on European exploration and expansion. Some of the Renaissance's influences were very specific and practical. From the Crusades, for example, Europeans gained access to gunpowder, which made European explorers a confident and terrifying force to be reckoned with. As we'll see in future lectures, gunpowder was perhaps one of the most important factors in European expansion and colonization, because gunpowder gave Europeans the military advantage they needed to conquer and seize land from Native American societies and to overpower and enslave African peoples. But the Renaissance had significant ideological influences on exploration as well. Classical texts obtained during the Crusades brought a renewed emphasis on philosophy and science that ultimately prompted the rise of a philosophy known as humanism. And humanism became a crucial ideological impulse that drove European exploration and expansion in the centuries that followed. So, how and why did that happen? Well, humanism influenced exploration in two important ways. First, it renewed interest in science, urging Europeans to imagine and create new technologies. Simultaneously, it inspired them to become more intellectually and scientifically curious, which fueled desires to investigate and learn more about the world. Humanism also influenced European religion and cultural worldviews. Prior to the Renaissance, Western Europeans were urged to place God and religion above all. But humanism placed new emphasis on the individual and the human, causing people to reflect more on their lives on Earth rather than on their souls in the afterlife. This was a critically important ideological shift because the increased focus on the earthly realm and individual desires inspired a powerful movement to accumulate wealth and to explore the world to find it. So ultimately, it was humanism, combined with other factors such as population increase, technological advancements, and high-yield agricultural production that sparked a growing movement towards European expansion. But here's an important point to keep in mind. Desire for exploration and expansion did not necessarily imply the ability to do so. So now that we understand why Europeans wanted to explore beyond their region, the next question is, how did they do it? At the beginning of the 15th century, Western Europeans' attempts at long-distance exploration were stymied by poor seafaring technology. Mediterranean cargo ships were essentially ancient barges. They tended to be extremely heavy and slow. They were not well equipped or designed for long voyages. Strangely, despite their massive size, these boats were surprisingly fragile. With only one central mast holding a fixed square sail, they couldn't handle strong winds or powerful ocean currents, making exploration into the Atlantic Ocean essentially impossible. Initially, then, European traders focused their efforts on North Africa. As I mentioned earlier, the Portuguese were particularly successful in that region, capturing key strategic ports in North Africa and on the tip of the western coast. And once Prince Henry the Navigator learned about the troves of gold in West Africa, he began funding exploration southward along the African coastline. But explorers and traders faced numerous challenges. No Europeans had ever explored this region before. As a result, there were no maps or signposts to guide them along the way. They simply had to set sail and let the water guide them, especially since Europeans had barely begun to use compasses or other navigational equipment during this time. Compounding the problem were their large, clunky ships. They were difficult to manage and steer on the open ocean. Sailors were not particularly adept at navigating along shallow coastal waters, but determined Portuguese explorers persevered in their mission. In 1418, they painstakingly began to explore the western coast of Africa, financed by Prince Henry himself. Rather quickly, they encountered trouble as a massive storm blew them off course. But that accident became fortuitous for the Portuguese because the sailors stumbled across an island off the west coast of Africa that they later named Porto Santo. They selected the name, which means holy harbor, because the sailors believed that the island's harbor, which protected them during the storm, was a sign of divine protection. Under Henry the Navigator's direction, the Portuguese claimed and colonized Porto Santo and soon extended their reach to nearby islands, an island chain that eventually became known as the Madeira Islands. In the early 1420s, the Portuguese began using settlements on the Madeira Islands to launch investigations along the northwestern African coast. But their initial exploration yielded little. And over the next 15 or 20 years, many Portuguese scoffed at Prince Henry for his wasteful spending. After decades of funding, his explorers had returned with little actual trade profit. They believed it was all for nothing. But starting in the early 1440s, everything changed as Portuguese traders began trading in humans. Whenever I teach about European exploration in West Africa, one of my students inevitably asks, so who was the first African sold into slavery? What they really mean, of course, is when and where did Europeans first start purchasing humans and enslaving them? So here's what I tell them. We don't actually know the name or identity of the first person that the Portuguese enslaved, but we do know when and where it happened. In 1441, one of Prince Henry's ships finally reached Cape Blanco on the border between modern-day Western Sahara and Mauritania. Initially, the captains engaged in small local trade, exchanging items for food and trinkets. But one Portuguese sailor decided to capture some Africans and return them to Portugal as gifts for Prince Henry. After encountering an African man and woman near a river, he ambushed them, captured them, and brought them to his ship. Inspired by his idea, other crew members decided to repeat his strategy. According to one observer's journal, the captain told the crew, "We have already got our cargo, but how fair a thing would it be if we were to meet with some good fortune and bring the first captives before the presence of our prince?" That night, a raiding party captured 10 more Africans, including one member of the local ruling elite. Having seized a total of 12 Africans, the captain and his crew triumphantly returned to Portugal. According to one report, Prince Henry responded with joy, not so much for the number of captives taken, but for the prospect of other captives that could be taken. In the following year, the Portuguese traders returned to the same port. Apparently, they were now aware that one of the Africans they captured occupied significant status in his community. They traded that same man for 10 more Africans plus some gold dust. 2 years later, in 1444, Portuguese merchants formed a trading company and pleaded with Prince Henry to provide them a license to buy and sell humans along the African coastline. He agreed, and armed with 6 ships, they began trading in human flesh. Meanwhile, Portuguese explorers continued their slow and steady progress down the African coast, searching for gold, treasure, and humans. In 1445, they reached the Senegal River, which stretches from the African coast over 1,000 miles into the interior. And in the following year, they found the Gambia River, another major thoroughfare just to the south, linking the African interior to the coast. As we'll see in our next session, rivers eventually became essential to European traders who wanted to penetrate the interior and capture Africans to enslave. Although the buying and selling of human beings along the African coast began slowly, it rapidly became profitable. By 1448, just 7 years after the first Africans were captured, a regular trade had developed in which Africans were enslaved and sent to Portugal as domestic laborers. The trade had become so extensive, in fact, that Prince Henry built a fort and warehouse on a small island just off the coast of Mauritania to facilitate the sale of humans. But the most significant development occurred around 1450, when Prince Henry resolved to create a ship that could withstand seafaring more effectively than a typical barge. Under his guidance, shipbuilders created the caravel, the single most important technological advancement in the story of European expansion. A much lighter, more maneuverable ship, the caravel could sail farther and faster than any of its predecessors. More importantly, the caravel had been completely redesigned. Rather than one square sail in the middle of the ship, a caravel used 2 or 3 triangular shaped sails. This technology allowed caravels more flexibility to harness varying wind patterns. It also allowed captains to sail in shallower water, meaning they could sail right along the coastline and even up large rivers. In short, the caravel was a game changer. Not only did European incursion into Africa increase rapidly, it also allowed for expansion across the Atlantic into the Americas. As we'll discuss in our next session, when Christopher Columbus set off across the ocean, he did so in a caravel. In later years, the caravel was remodeled and updated to make it even more seaworthy, and the ship style took on new names. But the caravel is the ship that is remembered for launching 1 million more ships that followed. Many of them were slave ships. As early as 1460, 700 to 800 Africans were being enslaved and imported into Portugal on an annual basis. And in 1472, the Portuguese created a formal arrangement with the King of Benin, who gave them permission to trade gold, ivory, and humans. Over the next 40 years, the removal of Africans increased as the Portuguese and later the Dutch, Spanish, and French established forts and trading stations along the West African coastline. By the year 1500, about 50,000 Africans had been enslaved, most of whom were brought into Europe, where they were used mainly as domestic and agricultural laborers. The remainder were enslaved just off the West African coast on the Madeira, Canary, and Cape Verde Islands, where they toiled on sugar plantations in a system that eventually became the model for commercial crop cultivation in the Americas. Enslavement progressed aggressively during this period, but it's important to remember that the process of exploring and forging trade relationships was not as easy for Portuguese and other European traders. Africans did not always desire to trade humans, and in the early years, the Portuguese struggled with poor planning, ineffective negotiation strategies, and tropical disease. So let's first consider the challenges that the Portuguese faced in trade negotiations with West Africans. Given the decentralized nature of political systems in West Africa at the time of European contact, the Portuguese did not have the ease or luxury of negotiating with one single emperor or king as they attempted to establish trade relationships along the African coastline. Unlike in previous centuries, the Western Sudan no longer had a unified empire and no singular authority. And as we discussed in our last session, the Southern coastal societies never had such large-scale structures to begin with. So as the Portuguese sought to forge a trade network, they had to undergo a painstaking process of creating new relationships with each local king or leader they encountered. In some cases, this was a smooth and simple process. In other cases, African societies were leery of European strangers and refused to interact. Some were even openly hostile. The Portuguese reported numerous attacks on their ships, many of which were successful, since Africans tended to use smaller, steerable vessels that allowed them to strike hard and retreat quickly. On numerous occasions, Africans slaughtered entire crews. Europeans also had to contend with an equally deadly enemy, tropical disease. European traders began to refer to the African coast as the white man's grave, in part because Africans defended their territory against invaders, but also because Europeans were ill-prepared to contend with diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, and smallpox. West Africans had been practicing inoculation as a preventative measure to stave off smallpox for centuries. Europeans found themselves vulnerable to such threats, especially malaria and yellow fever, which were spread by ever-present mosquitoes in the humid climate. Despite these challenges, after many attempts and an awkward process of trial and error, the Portuguese became more successful at establishing trade agreements along the coast. Trading a variety of goods, including gold, pepper, and ivory, the purchasing of humans gradually became more common. And by the year 1600, people became the dominant commodity. As we'll see in the next lecture, the practice of buying and selling humans rapidly transformed the West African trade system, particularly as the demand for human labor increased. What began as a small-scale trade among equal trade partners quickly shifted into a horribly unequal dynamic. Europeans used raiding and military force to extract humans from the African interior in an insatiable desire to obtain labor for the rapidly growing plantations in the Americas. Before we close this session, I want to offer remarks on the terminology I have been using in these lectures so far, and some of the terminology I will use in future lectures. You may have noticed, for example, that I haven't used words such as tribe, slave, or slave trade. This wording is intentional, and even though it is sometimes awkward to say trade in humans rather than slave trade, I think it's important to choose our words carefully, even if we risk experiencing a bit of awkwardness. So why is language and terminology so important? Let's start with the word tribe. Until recently, everyone, including historians and scholars, used the word tribe to describe communities of people living in historical times. And it was most commonly used to refer to Native Americans or Africans. It seemed like a perfectly innocent word, and for a long time, no one questioned it. But increasingly, in scholarly communities and among the general population, tribe began to take on some negative connotations. Europeans were described as living in cities, communities, villages, and societies under the rule of kings. Meanwhile, Native Americans and Africans were described as living in huts, teepees, and tribes ruled by chiefs or warlords. The implication was that Europeans were civilized, orderly, and respectable, whereas Native Americans and Africans were primitive, disorganized, and savage. Such stereotypes reinforce the idea that Europeans were inherently civilized and superior, while other peoples and cultures were inherently savage and inferior. For this reason, you will not hear me using the word tribe during these sessions. Instead, as I have done so far, I will use terms such as communities, societies, and villages in an effort to show that Native Americans and Africans lived in very similar social and political structures as their European counterparts. Similarly, over the last 20 or 30 years, historians have moved away from using the word slaves towards the use of enslaved people. Again, in daily conversation and even sometimes in writing, it feels much easier to say slave instead of enslaved person. So what's the big deal? Why not just say slave? And I get it when my students ask me that question, because it is so much simpler and less awkward to say slave. But I believe that language matters. Ultimately, the decision to describe someone as enslaved rather than as a slave is about recognizing their fundamental humanity. It's really about embracing the core ideals of natural rights philosophy, the ideology that inspired the American Revolution, which was the belief that all human beings have a natural birthright, an inherent right to liberty and freedom. So rejecting the term slave is a way of insisting that being a slave is an unnatural state, that one is always a person, a human first, and that the only way for a human to occupy that unnatural position is to be forcibly and immorally enslaved. Choosing enslaved over slave is about recognizing that no human being is naturally a slave. No one is born a slave. All people are first born as humans, and all humans have an inherent right to liberty and freedom. It's only oppressive economic, political, and social systems that allow for a human to be enslaved. The same rationale applies for using trade in humans or human trade rather than slave trade. Here, I can definitely understand why people balk at the phrasing. Trade in humans is clumsy and awkward, and it's vastly more comfortable to simply say slave trade. Believe me, I know that referring to the transatlantic trade in humans is long and exhausting. But here again, I believe language matters. I admit that when I'm lecturing in my college classes, I do sometimes slip up and say slave trade for the sake of ease and brevity. But I strive and will continue to strive to use trade in humans for such discussions, because I never, ever want us to lose sight of what we're really talking about. We're talking about kidnapping, stealing, and torturing men, women, and children, human beings, and selling them for profit. So yes, I know it's easier to say and to listen to slave trade. But trade in humans is important to say and to hear, because it reminds all of us that at the center of this story are millions of people, human beings who were bought and sold like property in order to enrich the lives of those who sought to deny their fundamental right to live free. Next, we'll delve deeply into the transatlantic trade in humans by examining a series of critical questions. How, when, and why did trading humans expand so rapidly beginning in the 16th century? Why were Africans willing to sell other Africans into slavery? And what was the relationship between the enslavement of Africans and the expansion of Europeans into the Americas? We'll grapple with these questions and more in our next session. In 1481, the King of Portugal developed a plan to construct a fort on the West African coastline. Strategically placed near the village of Adina in modern-day Ghana, the fort would benefit from its location near an active trade network, with ample amounts of gold and plenty of resources. Most importantly, the king believed that establishing a military installation would protect Portuguese traders against their growing competitors in the region. In December, a fleet of 10 caravels and 2 transport ships set sail for West Africa, transporting a large crew and a stash of supplies for the fort's construction, including heavy foundation stones and roof tiles. Quite significantly, on board one of these ships was Genoese sailor Christopher Columbus, who would make global history about 10 years later when he set sail for the Americas. The caravan arrived at Adina in January 1482, prepared to begin construction. But there was a problem that the Portuguese king had not foreseen. The local African people, known as the Fonte, had not approved the building of a fort or any of the houses or other buildings that the Portuguese had planned. They were strongly opposed. Their political leader, Kwame Ansa, was particularly hesitant to approve a permanent Portuguese settlement. Based on their previous interactions, he believed that Portuguese traders should be allowed to pass through the region on trade missions, but not remain on a permanent basis. After all, Ansa explained, that was the only way to avoid future disputes. According to Portuguese records, Ansa apparently stated, It is far preferable that both our nations should continue on the same footing they have hitherto done, allowing your ships to come and go as usual. Seeing each other occasionally will preserve peace between us. In response, the Portuguese tried to convince Anza that the fort could be mutually beneficial. It would certainly allow the Portuguese to trade more effectively, but their military presence would also protect the Fonte people from other foreign invasions. Even so, Anza remained reluctant, which prompted the Portuguese to try other strategies, ranging from offers of lavish gifts to outright threats of violence if the Fonte did not comply. Finally, Kwame Ansa relented to the king's demands, but in the end, it turned out that Ansa had been right. The fort's construction only led to further disputes. In order to gain sufficient land to build the fort, the Portuguese demolished the homes of numerous local residents. Although the Africans were compensated for their lost property, resentment began to grow. Conditions worsened after the Portuguese, who needed more stone to build the fort, raided a nearby rock formation. For the local Fonte people, that was not just any pile of rocks. It was, they believed, the home of a god that governed a nearby river. Enraged by the destruction of their god's home, the Fonte launched a counterattack, killing several Portuguese sailors. In retaliation, the Portuguese crew burned much of the local African village to the ground. Although a temporary peace between the Portuguese and the Fonte was eventually achieved, the tensions and disputes that Ansa had predicted only grew stronger in the years that followed. In the meantime, the fort was quickly constructed, and it became the first European building on the West African coast. Initially named St. George of the Mine, it soon became known simply as Elmina, the mine, reflecting the Portuguese king's desire to mine the West African coast for gold and other trade goods. Over time, however, the Portuguese and other European nations would soon be mining Africa for humans. And Elmina became a terrifying dungeon where Africans were stored, awaiting transport to the Americas. This lecture examines the development and expansion of the trade in humans, giving special attention to how various European nations became involved in the trade, why Africans initially were willing to trade humans, and how the demand for labor in the Americas caused the trade to spiral out of control. Thus far, you've probably noticed we've been talking mostly about the Portuguese and their role in exploring and then colonizing the West African coastline. This is understandable, since the Portuguese were the first Europeans to penetrate West Africa and to begin buying humans. But as the story of Elmina Fort indicates, the Portuguese were not alone. Although it took decades for other Europeans to join the West African trade network, once they did, it became an international feeding frenzy, as the Dutch, French, and British each established settlements and military forts, and viciously competed for control of the trade. Here, it's instructive to return to the original construction of Elmina and consider its ultimate purpose. Certainly, the fort was intended to provide shelter and housing for Portuguese traders, but it was also important as protection against European and Arab trade competitors. Elmina and the other forts that followed were not just trading posts. They were heavily armed military fortresses designed to protect traders from piracy, raids, and assault. Notably, the forts were not designed to defend against African foes. Instead, all of their weaponry, particularly the large cannons, were pointed out towards the sea, out of fear that pirates and traders might steal their growing wealth. And the wealth generated along the West African coast was significant. By the height of the gold trade in the early 16th century, 24,000 ounces of gold were exported annually from that region, accounting for 1/10 of the world's supply. To this day, it is still known as the Gold Coast. And later, the Gold Coast housed the most active trading ports for the buying and selling of humans. Usually when I reach this point in my classes, there is at least one brave student who was willing to ask an obvious but difficult question. Why, they timidly ask, did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? It's a hard question to ask because it can be interpreted wrongly and entirely misunderstood. It can be taken to mean that the person asking the question is blaming African people for the rise and expansion of the trade in humans, when really they just want to know why Africans didn't just refuse to sell people. After all, in order for the trade to happen, you need both buyers and sellers. So in my mind, it's a fair question. And here's what I say to my students. It's important to acknowledge that in the early years of trading with Europeans, some, although not all, African rulers were willing to sell humans. In my view, this occurred for three reasons. First, as we've discussed previously, many West African societies had pre-existing systems of enslavement and servitude. Although notions of slavery were different among these cultures than the systems of slavery that emerged in the Americas, West Africans did routinely sell their enemies or captives of war into bondage. So when the Portuguese arrived and wanted to purchase a few people, along with gold, ivory, and pepper, it didn't seem radically different from the trading most West Africans conducted with each other and with neighboring Arab nations. The second point is related to the first, which is that in the early years of the trade, no one could have imagined what the nature of American slavery would become. For societies that had maintained systems of servitude for generations, how could they have known that the cruel, inhumane system that developed in the Americas would become what it did? West Africans had no reason to think that servitude and unfreedom elsewhere would be any different than what it was among themselves. Third, and I admit this point can be difficult to grasp, during this period, there really was no such thing as Africans selling other Africans into slavery. What do I mean by that? Well, today in contemporary society, we think of Africa as a singular continent, and we refer to people from that continent as Africans. But in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the people who lived on that continent did not necessarily think of themselves as Africans. They certainly did not identify with each other as a united people. After all, there were thousands of languages, cultures, and societies across the continent, each with their own unique ethnic identity. In West Africa alone, there were hundreds of ethnic groups: Akan, Wolof, Fon, Mandingo, Fonte, Bakongo, Fulani, Igbo, and so many more. For those people, their village and ethnic identities mattered, and their kinship networks and lineage were vitally important. Some societies even used markings, scars, and teeth filing as ways to signify which ethnic group they came from. But they had no common identity with other Africans beyond their own ethnic group. So when we think about trading humans along the West African coast, we need to think, for example, about Akan people selling Igbo people into bondage, or vice versa, rather than Africans selling Africans into slavery. This distinction is vitally important to understand, especially once the demand for human labor became insatiable. And the demand did quickly become insatiable as the trade spiraled rapidly out of control. Over time, the trade relationship between Europeans and Africans became entirely unbalanced, and most African societies, especially those located along the coastline, had no choice except to participate in the human trade. Once Europeans dominated the trade, Africans had no other option. It was either sell others or be sold yourself. Here I want to return to a point I made in a previous lecture. The collapse of the Songhai Empire in the Western Sudan was vitally important to this story, because as Europeans increasingly demanded human labor, most West African societies found themselves unable to fight against them. Weakened by conflict with Moroccans and other invaders, or otherwise politically decentralized, communities could not resist against European encroachment, especially since Europeans came toting guns. Unable to stem the tide of European demand, West Africans had to make painful choices: Either they had to participate in the trade or succumb to enslavement themselves. So this naturally leads to the next logical question. Why did demand for human labor become so insatiable? What changes occurred that caused the trade in humans to spiral so completely out of control? The answer returns us to the topic of European expansion. Because as the Portuguese were exploring West Africa, they, along with other European nations, were beginning to explore and colonize the Americas. The Portuguese ultimately focused the bulk of their exploration and expansion efforts on Africa and India. In 1488, a Portuguese explorer finally found the southern tip of the African continent and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, successfully locating the path around Africa to India. This fueled Portugal's fascination with trade in Africa and India, and they ultimately only colonized one main country in the Americas. Other Europeans, however, especially the Spanish and the Dutch, became obsessed with exploration in another direction. While the Portuguese sailed south and east, the Spanish went west. By the late 15th century, Spain was primed and ready to join the exploration game. Having consolidated its power, the Spanish crown became increasingly interested in exploring the world along with the Portuguese. Christopher Columbus, who had gained training as a merchant and sailor in Portugal and who had participated in constructing Elmina, convinced the Spanish crown that he could bring wealth to the country by establishing a new trade route to Asia. Such a possibility was extremely appealing for the Spanish. As Spain was located on the far western side of the Mediterranean Sea, the Spanish crown was especially eager to find alternative routes to Asia. Ships traveling through the Mediterranean headed towards Asia had to pay sizable taxes in every major port they visited. For the Spanish, who had the longest distance to travel, such journeys were an expensive proposition. So when Columbus insisted that he could find an alternate route, the Spanish crown agreed to fund him. So in 1492, Columbus set sail across the Atlantic Ocean and stumbled on the region that would become known as America. For centuries, Columbus was celebrated as the man who discovered America. But it's hard to discover a place where millions of people have already been living for thousands of years. So Columbus obviously didn't discover America. He simply stumbled upon a region that had previously been unknown to Western Europeans, and he urged the Spanish crown to colonize it. After a few initial attempts, Columbus and his crew finally came upon a group of islands that are now known as the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, which is the island that Haiti and the Dominican Republic share. Thrilled by his alleged discovery, Columbus believed he had landed somewhere near Asia. For the remainder of his life, he never knew the truth. Instead, thinking he had landed somewhere in the Indies, Columbus began referring to the native people as Indios. And today, many people still refer to the Caribbean as the West Indies. Although Columbus never knew his true location, it apparently mattered little to him. What mattered most was the enormous profit he believed he could glean from these islands. Confident that the region contained human and material resources that could be exploited for financial gain, he wrote enthusiastically to the Spanish crown in his official report. "Hispaniola is a miracle," he said. "The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals." In the conclusion, Columbus promised that if the Spanish crown continued to support his voyages, he would bring back as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask for. When Columbus reached the Bahamas, he remarked similarly about the resources, both material and human. In commenting on the Arawak, the indigenous people in the Bahamas, he wrote, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for glass beads. They are well built with handsome features. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." What's particularly noticeable here is Columbus's comments on enslavement and the system of exchange. In both Hispaniola and the Bahamas, Columbus excitedly reported about how easy he believed it would be to enslave the indigenous population and exploit their labor to extract the island's natural resources. He also assured the Spanish crown that he could increase Spain's wealth enormously through unequal trade. After all, according to Columbus, the islands were rich in gold, metal, and spices, which could be easily obtained by enslaving the native population. And in exchange for nothing more than glass beads, Columbus noted, the indigenous inhabitants were willing to provide exotic and valuable items, such as parrots and cotton. They were even willing to hand over their own weapons. Immediately thereafter, the Spanish crown authorized the use of their ancient encomienda system, a labor system that required Native Americans to submit to Spanish rule and gave Spanish explorers the right to enslave, kill, and raid all native populations who resisted. Christopher Columbus died in 1506, but the Spanish, inspired by his promise of profit, continued his plan for conquering the Americas. In less than a decade, millions of the indigenous Taínos and Arawak had been enslaved or slaughtered as the Spanish expanded their bloody campaign of conquest. So by the late 15th century, exploration and expansion were no longer only the terrain of the Portuguese. As the Spanish blazed into the Americas, they battled with the Portuguese for supremacy. To avoid extended conflict, Spain and Portugal finally reached an agreement in 1494. Known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, the two nations created a demarcation line, dividing up territory for exploration and colonization. The line was located about halfway between the Cape Verde Islands and the Bahamas, and it arced just wide enough in the middle to include modern-day Brazil. Regardless of the millions of people who already inhabited the Americas, the treaty dictated that any of the lands west of that line would belong to Spain, and all lands to the east would be claimed by Portugal. This arrangement worked well for the Portuguese, since they were already focusing most of their attention on Africa and India. Plus, the strategic placement of the demarcation line allowed them to colonize Brazil. Although it was only one colonial possession, it was a large and profitable one. Meanwhile, Spain could continue its mission to raid, plunder, and colonize the rest of the Americas. And yet, competition over European expansion had only just begun. Over the next century, the Dutch, French, and English all began to push aggressively into West Africa and the Americas. After one failed attempt in 1596, the Dutch seized Elmina from the Portuguese 40 years later. And beginning in 1637, the Dutch assumed control over most of Portugal's holdings along the upper West African coast. The English, of course, were the last to join the movement for exploration and colonization. But when they did, they came with a vengeance. After all, for Europeans, there was a profit to be made on every leg of the transatlantic trade, a trade that became known as the triangular trade because it linked Western Europe, West Africa, and the Americas in a triangle-shaped trade route. Following the route from Europe to Africa to the Americas and back, the trade flowed in this fashion. Europeans exported luxury items such as guns, alcohol, and clothing into West Africa in exchange for gold, spices, and human beings, which were then brought to the Americas for sale. Then traders would take raw materials produced by enslaved labor in the Americas, such as sugar, rice, silk, indigo, and tobacco, and sell them for extremely high prices back in Europe. Notice that this trade relationship turned out to be exactly what Christopher Columbus had predicted. Europeans sold items such as glass beads, clothing, and alcohol in exchange for extremely valuable items such as cash crops, and of course, human beings. By the early 16th century, almost 200,000 Africans had been transported to Europe and the islands they had claimed off the West African coast. But Spanish expansion into the Americas altered human history forever. Within only a few decades, Spanish explorers and traders began colonizing the Americas and settling across the region, particularly in what are now the Caribbean islands. Colonists quickly learned that the Americas were highly conducive for high-yield agricultural production, and they began enslaving the indigenous population, forcing them to cultivate sugar and then later tobacco, coffee, rice, cotton, and indigo. Although Europeans initially relied on enslaved Native American labor, that plan quickly began to fail for many reasons. Most obviously, Native Americans could more easily escape enslavement since they were familiar with the terrain and could run, hide, and even ambush their enemies more effectively. The real issue, however, was disease. Europeans came to the Americas carrying horrific communicable diseases that devastated the indigenous population. Prior to European arrival, Native Americans had not been exposed to such illnesses and had not developed the necessary immunity to fight off highly contagious diseases such as smallpox. Vulnerable to infection, Native Americans died by the millions as Europeans pushed into their territory. Meanwhile, as labor demands became insatiable, Europeans turned to Africa. Beginning in the early 1500s, the trade in humans grew rapidly and aggressively. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese ramped up their efforts to find human labor, using riverways along the African coast to penetrate the interior. As I mentioned earlier, by the year 1510, the Portuguese were already purchasing and enslaving about 3,500 Africans every year. And by 1560, that number increased to over 5,000 per year. That dynamic dramatically increased starting in 1518, when the King of Spain, Charles I, issued a charter authorizing the transportation of Africans directly from Africa to the Americas. His choice to establish a direct, more profitable human trade from Africa to the Americas forever altered the nature and scale of human trafficking. Within several decades, raiding the African interior and trading human bodies had both become full-time professions, particularly as other nations, especially France, England, and the Netherlands, became heavily invested in the trade. In fact, by 1619, when the first Africans were sold into bondage in the British colonies in mainland North America, European ships had already brought 1 million Africans to colonies and plantations in the Americas and forced them to labor as slaves. About a century later, in 1713, in an agreement known as the Asiento, England assumed control over the transatlantic trade in humans, enslaving about 20,000 Africans per year. By the 1790s, the number increased to about 50,000 humans each year. Banning the international trade in humans was finally put into effect in 1808, but even so, it continued illegally for nearly another century. At this point, my students always want to know one thing: how many Africans were actually enslaved? What was the total number of people who suffered enslavement during this time? Every time they ask, it breaks my heart to admit the honest truth. We'll never know. As we'll discuss in future lectures, even though human trafficking was considered legal, it was not regulated, and there were no rules governing ship captains. Therefore, we can only rely upon the surviving records to provide an estimate. After lengthy debate among historians, most scholars now agree there were over 50,000 voyages across the Atlantic Ocean transporting human cargo, and about 12 million Africans were enslaved and arrived alive in the Americas. Now, keep in mind that this number does not include the people who died during or immediately following capture, or those who died during the journey from the interior to the African coastline. Nor does it include those who perished in a dungeon awaiting sale. It also ignores all those who were forced onto slave ships but did not survive the journey across the ocean. It only includes those who endured every moment of their enslavement and arrived alive somewhere in the Americas. So when we consider everyone who suffered enslavement but did not survive the trade, the number reaches into the tens of millions. Even so, it's important to reflect upon the massive number of Africans who did survive. As I always remind my students, the statistics are staggering, particularly when you consider that 6 out of every 7 people who made the journey across the Atlantic and arrived in the Americas prior to the American Revolution were Africans. 6 out of every 7 were Africans. In the next lecture, we'll begin our discussion of the human trade itself. What occurred during each phase, capture, sale, and the journey to the Americas? And how did Africans cope with and endure their enslavement?